Welcome to our workshop on Islamophobia, but we're actually going to change the name to anti-Muslimism, and Dina will explain why. So this is part of the AFSC's Strategic Initiative Program, and right now it's happening in various programs in various regions in the United States, and it's experimental. So it's a pilot program, and it's actually a 5-hour workshop that we will not do today. It's a condensed mini workshop. So the contributors include staff of the AFSC, but also partners in the Muslim and Arab communities that have been working on these issues for quite some time. Next.
Oh wait, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Gabriel Camacho. I work for the American Friends Service Committee out of the Cambridge office, and my work has mostly been on immigration.
My name is Dina El-Rifai, and I am from the DC office, and I mainly work on policies that impact the Muslim community, and I also work on immigration, refugee, and a little bit of criminal justice. So I wear a lot of kind of different hats, but yeah. Also forgive my sitting and tea. I'm feeling a little under the weather today.
And I'm Zerkel. I work out of the Chicago office on peace-building issues and also coordinate a couple of national projects, including this one. And so we have, this work is happening in Cambridge, where Gabe is, in Chicago, where I am. Dina's our DC connection, but we also have work in Indianapolis and just starting in Greensboro, North Carolina. So now we want you to do little intros. Just if you gather up, because we're going to do a bit of small group work, so if you just gather up with a small group, just kind of introduce yourselves. We'll just take a minute for that. So we could have like maybe one here. There's probably like 3 small groups. Just organize yourselves. That would be great.
Or if you know each other, you can go into the opposite end.
Yeah.
Come over here.
Why don't you move over?
Linda, you know each other? You know your wife? Sure.
Laurie has to. I don't know you. All right, I'll go with Andrew.
There's 4 of us in like 3 groups. So we
Yeah, 4 of 3 groups. We can't really disperse that much.
Which group is
Hey, Brewster.
4, 1, 2, 3, all right.
Now, hopefully everybody had a chance to say hello. So just to give you a sense, as Gabe said, their normal training that we do is 5 hours long, and so we're able to really dive deep. So we're calling this a mini workshop, and what we're going to try to do is develop an analysis of anti-Muslimism and the anti-Muslim narratives that permeate our culture. Develop some skills to try to shift out of that narrative if you want to be a helpful ally, and then kind of rethink the concept of allyship a little bit. What we will not be doing, we just try to be clear, like this is not an Islam 101 workshop. It's not an anti-bullying workshop. All these things are good, we're just not doing them. And you know, it can be, we want to make sure we get people's expectations. And it's so not comprehensive, we're really just scratching the surface here. These issues are multi-layered and really interesting, and we keep thinking of more modules that we can add. So this is just very not comprehensive. And obviously we're not all going to become experts in this. We're just kind of learning together, create a learning community. The last group we had, we learned all kinds of stuff from them, so I know we'll do the same with you here today. Dina's going to
Yes, so as Gabe mentioned earlier, we've kind of been moving from using the term Islamophobia to using anti-Muslimism. So calling the anti-Muslimism that Muslims experience a phobia suggests that this discrimination is solely a problem of individual bias, and it also undermines the source of these experiences as that of fear, which kind of obscures the structural and systemic production of anti-Muslim racism. The term Islamophobia also kind of feels more passive and centers kind of whiteness and white people's fears, whereas saying anti-Muslimism centers Muslims and communicates the real and active harm of anti-Muslim policies and rhetoric, communicates the actual intent and result of these policies and rhetoric, and essentially also is kind of communicates what it feels like as a Muslim. Anti-Muslimism kind of just communicates the real and active, again, intent and harm of the policies, and just centers Muslims and Muslim experiences. So, thanks.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
Yes.
Yeah, and also anti-Muslimism also can reach into the historical roots of where this phenomenon is coming from. Whereas Islamophobia is more like something personal, as Dina just said. There's something wrong with me, I have a fear of something, and maybe I can cure it, I don't know. But history, imperialism, colonialism, that's the roots of anti-Muslimism.
Thank you. So, we're going to get into sort of unpacking some of the myths, and this section is can be a little bit uncomfortable, because what we're going to ask you to do in your small group is to write down commonly held beliefs or myths that people have about Islam and Muslims, which, we may not hold those same ideas, so it's a little bit uncomfortable to say it out loud and write it down, but we just, this is the space to do it. Go ahead, move into the uncomfortableness.
And I guess I always like to say, since I'm the only visibly Muslim person in the room, some people might kind of feel like they need to filter themselves in what they write down or say. But I always like to say I lived in Tennessee for 12 years, and
You already heard it.
I've heard a lot. Yeah. So.
Exactly. So thank you for saying that, because I think it does give us a little bit of room to do that. But so discuss as many of these myths, what do you hear in the culture? Write one down per sticky, and then we're going to start collecting them from you right away, because we're going to categorize them. So give each group a pad of stickies and a pen. Yeah. I'll grab a pen for you guys. Can you join this
Who's the
one
best
here?
handwriter?
Not me.
No.
And not him.
Each write one or?
No, family, start with
Yeah,
me.
We can just discuss.
Alright,
Just have a discussion and just start writing them down one per
So
sheet.
many sheets from, this is supposed to be, these are
Yeah.
big myths that we're not prescribing to them by describing them. So myth number one is they all want to kill non-Muslims.
I think the implication is maybe perhaps negative or maybe.
That's probably the biggest one. Somebody else.
That they're pen or you want a marker?
sexist
I mean,
They're violent and they before there were no Muslims. Oh, you want us to say real close to better? Yeah. Hearing issues, me too. Hearing aids that sometimes work.
I don't know if I can, did you say that?
Yeah.
Sort of sexist or whatever.
Yes. Introduce yourself.
Why don't we do it again? We went around and did introduction at the beginning, but it was very quick. Sorry, I'm Mari. I work for the AFSC and Asia based in Yangon, Myanmar, as good international affairs rep there.
Okay, so if you could wrap up your discussions right now, and I'll collect your last sticky.
Tribal, that was like a new word.
I'll collect your last sticky notes, please, and then we can continue. So what we did with your sticky notes, and we'll continue to do, is we categorize them. Some have to do with the nature of Islam. The other one have to do with gender, with violence. There's a lot of East versus West narratives also in there.
Any more professional?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we kind of just put them in broad categories, so you can kind of see the myths that you came up with. Does anybody feel like anything they wrote didn't fit into these sort of broad categories?
No. He did so much.
Well, I had one point that I was kind of specifically came here to make, and I was curious what would happen if I made this point.
Oh, okay. What
I'm
is
kind
that?
of repeating somebody else's point, so it's not actually my point. And that is, if you take literally what's in the Quran, follow the Quran, they actually physically want to kill other people, other non-Christian, non-Muslim people. I guess that's the Sharia law.
No.
And like inherently bad.
So I think, would anybody in the group like to respond to that? Yep.
I've seen quantitative studies where they looked at the amount of violence in the Quran and compared it to the amount of violence in the New Testament and the amount of violence in the Old Testament. And my recollection is that the Quran has less violence than either of those other two texts. And they're sort of the three Abrahamic religions are all essentially one family of religions. They used to be called the people of the book. And I think more people should read the Quran. There's more about Mary, mother of Jesus, in the Quran than there is in the Bible.
Thank you, Sharon. And I mean, I think the other thing that to be conscious of is the Bible has been used to justify violence in many contexts. So we're not going to get into an examination of the Quran in this workshop, but we are going to look at, we are calling these myths for a reason, because you can't decide that a billion people, you know, there are many billions of people in the world who are Muslim, and that there are many different interpretations of the Quran. So I think we're going to, in this workshop, we're going to agree that there are different interpretations, and much like all the other religions, and we're going to look at these as myths and unpack the narratives. So if you're willing to be part of that discussion, we'd love you to stay. Any other responses? Yeah.
Yeah, Sharia law is not, it's a system of religious law, but maybe the analogy would be the canon law of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. That it's a system that is not necessarily a civil code or meant to be a civil code.
Yeah,
and it can coexist with a civil code and does in many countries.
Something's myth, it's not necessarily, it's a statement of beliefs.
Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was. I have read the Quran, Dawood translation, which I liked. And my overall impression is I wouldn't call, it's not a pacifist religion, but it does say over and over, Allah loveth not aggressors. So the idea is you're not to start a war, but you are allowed to finish one. So I wouldn't say inherently violent, and I would say it's a religion of peace, but there are certain things that I personally would disagree, which in terms are a command, and one of them is although you're not commanded to kill unbelievers, you are commanded to kill apostates. If somebody was Muslim and quit the faith, it says kill them. So I have a problem with that.
We're not going to get into the theological tenets of Islam or the interpretations thereof.
Okay.
That's okay.
And I do understand that not everybody takes every command literally.
Right, and I don't mean to shut down any discussion, but that's not what this workshop is all about. What we were trying to do with the sticky notes is to tease out categories of myths, dominant narratives, that are part of what we're calling anti-Muslimism, and then try to find out where it's coming from and see for what purpose this serves.
Yeah.
Any other final comments? Yes?
I don't know if you could maybe fit this into one of those, but something about homogeneity, that that Muslims are all Arab and Arabs are all Muslim, and that there's only one branch of Islam. And,
yeah, that's a really good one. Yeah, monolithic, and that we can, make assumptions about billions of people because they're all Muslim. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm going to go off of that, and that all Muslims also interpret, like another myth is that all Muslims would interpret, verses the same, or, and I just a quick point, I guess I would just say it's also important to look at context of verses that were revealed and what was going on at the time and why those verses were revealed. But that's just like a quick comment that I just want to address. But in general, yeah, I think those are main groups usually that myths would fall into.
So another word we could use for these myths are narratives, because they are stories that are being told in our culture over and over again, and that's why they're commonly held beliefs. So where are some of the places where we might hear these narratives being spun out?
Fox News.
Right on, yes, very true.
The White House.
Pardon me?
The White
House,
White
yes,
House.
indeed.
It's Breitbart.
Interchangeable a little bit today.
Stephen Bannon,
Breitbart.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and the media is really an important piece here. I mean, you guys have just named, there are people who are, you know, Islamophobic experts that appear on those 2 stations who are now part of the administration. So that's important to say. But in our longer workshop, we don't have time to do it today, we also examine liberal media bias, because that's important too. And it'll come up a little bit through other conversations we have, but it's important to look at that as well.
I just want to add one thing here. Mary said Islamophobic experts. They're not experts, they're propagandists. They're practiced in coding hate speech into political speech. And there's think tanks, there's institutions, there's even institutions and institutes of higher learning, such as Harvard, that harbor these individuals that are propagandistic in what they write and say.
It's an industry that profits off of.
We get it in educational institutions?
Yes, very much.
High schools, whatever.
Yeah, I've had a few stories, classes my daughter's been in where things have been.
I was just going to, and I don't know if it, well, go ahead.
Okay.
So Gabe, which people in which institutions at Harvard do you have in mind?
Oh, Samuel Huntington.
Yeah, he's dead. He's dead.
Yeah, but
his Clash of Civilizations has had pernicious effects.
Yeah.
We agree on that. Just curious about which living Harvard jerks you have in mind.
We actually have a list that we do in a different workshop. It's called the Islamophobic megaphone. So we start here with the funding organizations, then the think tanks, and then the so-called intellectual authors, and then the TV propagandists. And then we have some individual bios of who these Islamophobic experts are.
So Daniel Pipes would be among
Daniel Pipes, yeah, Steve Emerson,
yeah, got it.
etc. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, because you mentioned kind of where I was going, the intellectual authors. And
yes.
What I think of is Sam Harris. I don't know if you know.
Sam Harris. I'm not familiar with that name, but I will certainly look it
So
up.
he's basically, anyways, all right, didn't know.
So if you look at any, oh, I'm sorry, were you going to add something, Sarah?
Well, just with family as well, like our immediate environment is also important.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like, you know, we don't have time to totally unpack the sort of historical roots of this, but you know, I think Gabe mentioned it early, but you know, roots in colonialism and Orientalism. I mean, this is there are academic disciplines that are based around perpetuating these myths. If you look at those myths about violence, about oppression of women, I can go back to them. Do they relate to any other marginalized groups? Like, can you imagine them kind of being flipped on the other groups?
Virtually every marginalized group, immigrants in particular, are hit with variations on these themes. In fact, I can't think of exceptions, frankly.
Yeah, exactly right.
You know, as a Latino, I just want to say that we're often said that Latino culture is super macho and misogynistic. So that's one myth that relates to this one up here that can go across ethnicities. Inherently violent. I'm reminded. I'll remind you that police always target African Americans and Latinos because of their violence or because they're involved in criminality. Muslims refuse to assimilate and all Muslims are foreign. That's a take on the anti-immigrant narrative in the United States. We don't want to assimilate, why don't we learn English, blah, blah, blah. And that we all come from Mexico or South America, even though half this country was once part of the sovereign nation of Mexico.
Exactly.
She had a comment.
Oh, I'm
Just
sorry.
in particular on the refuse to assimilate and all foreign one, those are ones that you saw used against Japanese Americans in particular, as Asians are inscrutable, and because they're so inscrutable, says the myth, you can't look at them as individuals who are guilty or innocent, but they should be all targeted.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that was kind of to get into more of an intersectional framework. And so as we've kind of discussed, Islamophobia or anti-Muslimism is a racialized system that oppresses Muslims, black people, and brown people globally. In the same way that black and brown people, as we mentioned, are deemed uncivil, violent, and needing to be controlled, and thus are criminalized and otherized and locked up in our society in the name of law and order. Muslims are also demonized and criminalized at home in the name of national security, and Muslim countries are destroyed abroad in the name of democracy and liberation, all while this system profits off the bodies of people of color and seeks to control and repress them. Essentially, it is a system that justifies and authorizes its own use of violence against targeted people. It labels as uncivilized, as we mentioned, inherently violent, and threats to security. And thus presumes they have no say or rights to agency in what happens to them. And of course, Black Muslims face added police threats due to anti-Muslim surveillance programs, and thus are doubly victimized by the system. So I say that anti-Muslimism is racialized because the idea of how a Muslim looks like in itself is racially constructed, and thus one does not have to be Muslim to experience anti-Muslimism or be a target of anti-Muslim rhetoric or harassment. So in 2013, Daniel Canal shot Cameron Mohammed 20 times at close range with a pellet gun in a Walmart parking lot in Lutz, Florida, because he thought he was Muslim or from the Middle East. He asked Cameron if he was Muslim or from the Middle East, and Cameron truthfully said no. He was born and raised in Florida, and his parents are from Trinidad, and he's actually Catholic. Cameron, when the police captured Canal and told him that Cameron was neither Muslim or Middle Eastern, he said that he didn't care because they're all the same.
Wow.
Yeah, and actually, side note, the story actually grabbed headlines, not because of anything that we just said, but actually because Cameron Mohammed had a gun at the time, and he had a concealed carry permit, but decided not to shoot him, even though Daniel Canal shot him 20 times and continued to harass him. So there are several layers to Islamophobia and the ways in which it's institutionalized and built into structures of the state and of society in order to justify war and repression and surveillance. Islamophobia and anti-Muslim rhetoric and policies are part of a larger system of policing, of immigration restrictions and repression, all in the name of safety and security, which is what we're going to talk about later on, is the kind of the bigger systems that are at play.
That's what we need to erase our former answers. Could you mind doing that? So,
Yeah.
Don't look. So what we wanted to do now is, like, if you're somebody who really believes all Muslims are inherently violent, what kind of individual level harm might that give you sort of permission for, or what kind of state policy level harm could that, if the people in power in our country believe those things, what policies might they put in place?
Oh, they might go ahead.
It's a classic story where depicting a group as a threat has the effect of justification for preemptive measures and retaliatory measures on everything from immigration restrictions through preventive and preemptive war. And at an individual level, let's call it measures of harassment and preventive detention, imprisonment that we observe right now.
Yeah.
But it rests on a narrative of threat as a justification for actions, so that people feel that what they're doing as the oppressed is merely defensive.
Yeah, that's very well said. Thank you.
Robert Jervis.
Other thoughts, Sharon?
One of the ones that worries me is entrapment, and essentially using FBI agents or whatnot to engage people and try to solicit from them a willingness to commit acts of violence, and then, arresting them as terrorists.
Yeah. Thank you. That's an important piece, and that's been going on for many years, and it's really it has been exacerbated recently. Yeah. Other thoughts, policies, individual level harm that people. Again, yeah.
Sadly, I have to speak from personal experience. It's the legitimization of hate speech, especially on social media. The number of times that I was called a terrorist, a raghead, a number of different epithets. In the first 4 years of me being in the United States was doubled in the last 6 months.
Oh my God.
Wow. When I actually confronted one of these individuals and asked him why he felt emboldened to harass me, he said it's because our president is in power now.
Nice.
Our president.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Other thoughts people have?
Yeah, I've also seen, I study hatred between groups and I comment on it online, so I get in these threads. And I saw one guy who was urging his fellow, quote, Americans to go to your local mosque and take a machine gun and spray the place with bullets. And he did it under his own name publicly. He wasn't ashamed. So I found where he lived. I called all the mosques in the area I could find, called the police, and the police were very nice. It was up in, I believe, Wisconsin. And they said, we're going to go interview this gentleman. But he was proud of it. And you go to his Facebook page, he's this good-looking guy with this beautiful little baby in his arms.
Yeah, I wonder.
What can you even say?
Yeah. Well, that's how deep some of these stories feel to people. They really think that they're...
He believed it.
Yeah.
He believed it. Yeah.
Other policies that people have noticed recently? We're going to get into it more, too.
The travel ban.
Yeah.
Trump.
The two travel bans.
Yep. Muslim ban. Trump in general. Yeah.
And applying it to green card holders, visa holders, students.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think just profiling and surveillance in general, a lot of these policies are around that. But the other thing I would say is, think about our foreign policy. I think Ken actually alluded to it. It's, we're droning people, we're starting wars, we're taking preemptive action through our foreign policy, often in the name of these same narratives. All right, so I think we're going to move because we're going to run out of time.
There was one other comment.
Yeah, it was voter suppression, because some of the rhetoric in North Carolina General Assembly around voter reform has been to say we don't want undocumented people, and we don't want migrants or green card holders voting, but the way they do it means that it also legitimizes suppression of the black vote as well.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And all these myths enable us to just keep bombing
Yep.
country after country, and why should anybody care?
Yeah, no, exactly. 15 years later, everybody's numb to it, right?
Yeah, okay. So we've kind of teased out the larger systems that are at play and how policies are formed with those myths. And as we've seen from the Cameron Mohammed case, anti-Muslimism does not only affect Muslims, but is a racist response to a changing demographic of this country. So the visibility of black and brown people has sparked fear and hatred in a lot of people who feel that their powers and their privileges are at risk or are threatened. Anti-Muslimism is essentially a manifestation of nativism or white supremacy. It's a sentiment rooted in anti-immigrant and anti-black sentiment, which were both magnified, if you noticed, during the election season, as Trump supporters rallied to make America great again, which for people of color was dog whistle politics, really, for Make America White Again. Nativism is built on the notion that people who are perceived to be white are native to this country and that all others are foreign. So of course we know this to be false, as the truly native and indigenous people of this country are people of color and were occupied and killed by colonialists and imperialists. And we know that black Muslims who literally built this country now make up the largest segment of Muslims in America. But still, Muslim people have been constructed to mean foreign and immigrant, and only people who are perceived to be white are perceived to be native to this country, to belong, and to essentially be entitled to humane treatment and protections. So it is this idea of nativism, this prejudice against people perceived as strangers, or xenophobia, that allows the system to perpetuate, a system in which 60% of its incarcerated population are people of color, a system that creates wars but then demonizes its victims, and a system built on the genocide of one population and then the enslavement of another. So recognizing, so basically these ideas, perceptions, representations, and images that we kind of came up with, all the myths, are deeply embedded in the policies and laws that have been implemented, especially post 9/11, but certainly preceding 9/11, which is something that we're also going to talk about. But recognizing that this is a training for all allies, not just white allies. White allies in particular have an important and necessary role in dismantling nativism. And this starts with the recognition of how nativism and white supremacy have both been weaponized and utilized to uphold this oppressive system and strip away the rights of people of color.
Okay, so on these two walls and that window, you have a timeline. They're all the same. And it's basically an enforcement timeline. And what we're going to do now is get up from our chairs and take a quick tour of the timeline. You don't have to read every panel, but kind of get an idea of what this is trying to say. So I'm asking you to quickly read this and then tell me, what is this enforcement timeline saying? And also, do you notice any patterns, in particular, pre and post 9/11? So.
And how long do we have to read?
We have, how long?
3 minutes, 5 minutes, something like that. I'm saying 3 minutes.
We start from the left. Yeah, we start from the left.
Yeah.
Okay, we have about 1 minute left.
More time.
Yes, I know. But if you're interested, I can email these to you.
Okay.
Great.
Did you hear that? Ken?
Yep, I did.
So Ken, you may want to know that Mary was the main author.
I kind of thought so.
Not Mary me, Mary Gabe's wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I recognize parts of the narrative, but now it's updated.
Yeah, I know.
That's what she was presenting in the workshop. In fact, her presentation. Such great content.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah. I know. And he's one of those. All right, if we could take our seats, and these will still be up. So, and I promise, if you're interested, I'll email them to you. So, the first question: what is the overall story that this timeline tells you? Anybody? Yes.
We have a secret police that looks at things and gets funding and ratchets up fear in America and makes the public more cowardly and less people of integrity and
It has a
equality.
has a chilling effect on the rest of us. Okay?
The main point is that what we've been seeing recently is not new. That there's a long tradition of, let's call it, selective treatment of individuals from the Middle East with de facto and de jure reference to religion, that it intensified after 9/11, and it's not simply a question of Donald Trump and the Republican Party.
Right. Excellent point. One of the patterns that I was hoping would pop out of the timeline was if we use 9/11 as an artificial marker, you see that before 9/11, those that were targeted were mostly secular Arab nationalists, people involved in various secular nationalistic movements in the Arab world, in particular the various factions of the PLO. There was a lot of campus activity in the 1980s supporting the various factions of the PLO, and they were targeted. But after the Iranian Revolution and the last civil war in Lebanon, the big bogeyman became Islamists. And that's when the target changed from secular nationalism to the Muslim community, not just activists or devotees, but those in the Muslim community in general. Any other observations? Yes.
I'm really impressed by these I don't mean to say this like bits and pieces. These are instances that seem to be accumulating over time. To what extent, when you put them all together, does this represent a different type of political structure in the United States? You have these various government departments all working together. What do you call that?
It's called Homeland Security.
That's just, the latest reiteration of it. But we've seen other reiterations of these different enforcement programs throughout history. You had McCarthyism going after, quote unquote, communists. You had COINTELPRO program that was going after war activists, and also the Black Panthers, the Young Lords. So activists that were truly trying to get to change the system and fight for social justice were, throughout the history of the United States, targeted by various programs. This timeline is only showing you the programs targeted to secular Arab nationalists and then now Muslims. Yes?
Well, the other thing, and maybe this is just my particular focus, but some of that looks as though it's a very broad brush, based on demographics, young men between these ages and these ages, people coming from whatever countries. But there's also this kind of threatening network sort of thing that if you've ever given money to a particular charity, that could be designated as a terrorist organization, and then you, by association, are linked to that.
Right. And there are also, shortly after 9/11, individual bank accounts of Muslims that were shut down because of sending remittances back home or sending part of your salary to a charity. So this has been going on for a while. And also, if you look at some of the enforcement programs, they are easily transferable to immigrants in the Latino community. Mm-hmm. They're easily transferable to African Americans. And it's basically the criminalization of a people. And it starts with the most vulnerable and marginalized, and then expands to other populations and demographics, including white activists. If you remember, during the Iraq War, there were police infiltrators that went into Quaker meetings or anti-war meetings that AFSC was involved in. So this is not new. Are we going to focus on?
Yeah.
We're going to focus on, we're just going to briefly look at two enforcement programs. The first one is the National Security Entry Exit Registration System, also known as NSEERS. It started shortly after 9/11 in November of 2002. And basically what it did, it obligated non-immigrants from 25 predominantly Muslim and Arab countries to go to their regional INS center to register. And basically it was only for men 16 years and older from these 25 countries, including North Korea. They just threw it in there just to keep their bases safe and say we're not discriminating. And basically for those individuals that were able to go in and be interviewed with their lawyers present, they were not asked about their political or religious beliefs. Most who went to register and did get interviewed were asked about their religious and political beliefs. And remember, this is First Amendment protected activity. So, so in total, over 80,000 Muslim men had to register through this program. Of those 80,000, not one threat to national security or terrorist was identified, apprehended, or prosecuted under NCERS. However, over 13,000 of these individuals were detained and deported due to minor visa violations. So I put the focus on this program because the author of NCERS is Chris Kobach, who is the former State Secretary of Kansas, who is now one of the main immigration advisors of the Trump administration. So many Arab and Muslim civil rights organizations were saying that we're going to see a new NCERS program pretty soon. But I know there was a lot of preemptive activism within our different communities that made a big stink about it. And so far we've been able to stop NCERS 2.0. The other is a program that was modeled after something that has been used in the United Kingdom. And the name of this program is called Countering Violent Extremism. So basically, it's supposed to stop mostly young men from being radicalized. And the way it started in the United States was that not only targeted the Muslim communities, but the authors of the program said they would also target white nationalists and Aryan Nation folks and Klanners and stuff like that. But in reality, it was only applied and focused to the Muslim community. So right now, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice are sending out grants for community NGOs, schools, Health and Human Services to take these grants and then apply these programs locally. And again, it's one of these programs that in the end is aimed to infiltrate Muslim communities, seek out informants in the Muslim communities, and also to disempower their civic activity. So this is something that we need to keep an eye on. The various AFSC programs that are working on Islamophobia are also working to counter CVE, which I believe the name changed recently, right?
Yes, it did.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
So they changed the name of the program to make it more explicitly anti-Muslim. The question that I have is that one face of this program is engagement in the traditional sense. You were also suggesting that it was, the creation of secret informants within the communities was an element of this program. What is the story on that? Again, as distinct from open efforts to engage. And there's a difference between the two.
A lot of the money comes with strings attached. Mm-hmm. For example, have you implemented this particular program and workshop in the community? Who has attended these workshops and communities? So you need to prove that not only are you implementing the program, but you can back it up with members of your community. And then that information is shared with law enforcement. And that could be used for nefarious activities.
Also, just want to mention, in some of our communities, it's completely opaque. Like, you don't know who is part of this program or not. We've had to FOIA to find out who in Chicago is actually receiving this money. And right now we're starting to see it kind of secretly sneaking into the Chicago public schools. So we're trying to do some education with teachers ahead of time. But it's very difficult for community members to know if they're going to a forum that or participating in a program that is part of this or not. Was there
Yeah, two points. One is, I think this is one of the, I've heard rumors about entrapment, and I think this is one of the programs where people suspect that. But the other thing that's interesting is that there's now an aversion in some communities to taking any federal funding for fear that it's somehow linked to this or.
Yeah, I mean, after the Trump administration came in, there's actually a few programs, one in Minneapolis where we have a staff member who's been organizing against this, just flat out refused a $500,000 grant because they saw, at least under a Trump administration, they were like, no, we are not touching this. And it's happened in a couple other places as well. But it's it's a heavy lift because social services have been cut so drastically over the last several decades that for some people they're just like, I'll just see what I can do with this.
A number of community organizations in Massachusetts have received CVE money, and in response, Muslim civil rights organizations as well as allied organizations such as the AFSC has written a letter to these organizations trying to urge them to return the money because of A, B, C, and D reasons. Two more comments.
How broad spread is this? I mean, does it have to be?
How broad spread?
Yeah, is there a massive, just here and there?
Do you know the overall budget? I mean, there are 3 pilot cities.
Yeah.
And it's Boston, Minneapolis, and LA. And so that's where it's sort of known. But again, like, after we did FOIAs and stuff in Chicago, we found out like it had been in our community for several years, but nobody again knew where it was. So the answer to that, and even when you are working with like the Muslim Justice League and other folks who are like Brennan Center for Justice, folks who are really like focused on this, it's an incomplete picture. Nobody knows exactly.
Yeah, we're only peeling the top layer of the onion so far.
So, Gabe, do you or do you not have good information on acts of agents provocateurs being encouraged,
No, we don't.
or secret informants as distinct from, when I say the open engagement, the please inform us if you hear of terrorist activity, which is a little more above board.
Right.
Just, again, just trying to pin it down.
Yeah, we don't have that specific information.
I think what Shannon from Muslim Justice League has said to me that it might get a little bit to your question. The questions of entrapment that are somewhat, they have happened outside of this sphere where there's the secret informants. I think what Shannon's mentioned to me, because I was trying to understand like how does it shake down, is that if you're in a social service or education capacity and you're being asked to participate in this program, you're given these identifiers. So you're there, your kid is just going to school, but the teacher looks at them because they're becoming outwardly religious or whatever it is, or maybe they're being bullied, and those are the kids that get identified under this program.
It's basically a repurposing behind the scenes of programs unbeknownst to people.
Yeah, I mean, and what's happened, and this has not happened in the U.S. yet, but in the UK, teachers are you were compelled by law to participate in this program. So there are no outs. Yeah.
I visited a school in the UK that was doing the prevent system a couple of months ago, and it was really interesting to see how they've managed to kind of reclaim it. Because they're forced to do it, and they have a certain amount of hours, and they were like, okay, so within this context, how can we use this for good? So it's a school of 95% Muslim, and it's an all-girls school. So they were, for instance, talking about internet security, which is something that like the prevent system is really about, because that's how people are drafted, whatever, and made it into like internet security that's relevant for young women.
That's great.
And like it was just really interesting to see how they kind of really reclaimed it. Which, I mean, I don't know if that's a model that could be learned from. It's also really problematic when it's not forced, because that is a buying into it. But just another thought of kind of.
So that is wonderful. That is absolutely fantastic, because I've can probably tell by my accent, I come from the UK. Like yourself, I've seen it in action. And I think the most disheartening thing is how much of how this is implemented, because this is being implemented by ordinary citizens. It's not being implemented by any kind of trained professionals or anything like that. Stems from the demographic of the institution. So the schools in Harrow, which is where I originally come from, they're mostly now ethnic, and they have the same experience of Prevent, which is actually part of a larger program called Contest in the UK, which covers prevention, prepare, and a couple of other things. And so they, as the friend said over here, have reclaimed that. But then there's schools up in places like Oldfield in Manchester, very in large UKIP areas, where it's being turned and used in a very wrong way. And by wrong, I mean as a sort of surveillance and kind of strategic approach to the immigrant problem.
Yeah, and I think that's what folks here are really trying to get ahead of it before it goes down to this this road of being compelled by law to participate in it. We're trying to educate teachers. And I mean, you should mention what you guys have been doing.
Yeah, and with the Massachusetts Teachers Association, we've been trying to get local resolutions and or school boards to not accept money from this program, and also to teach principals and superintendents what this program is, because quite frankly, people don't know what it is. We're barely scratching the surface of what this means for our communities. And the other thing, for the record, Council on Islamic American Relations, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, the American Arab Institute, and a whole host of local Arab and Muslim organizations, civil rights organizations, are totally against this. So,
so this is just, yeah, it's Jim.
This is basically a more basic fundamental question, and with one fact point, which may or may not be right. So, but the whole narrative that there's this violent extremism, this radicalization process that's happening, and it's happening through mosques, or it's happening over the internet, and it's primarily people that were raised as Muslims. All of that seems to me a narrative that's ripe to be reframed, thrown out, whatever. And the one thing that's striking me, the sort of the British experience, is they said that the people that are radicalized over the internet and that are drawn to radicalism weren't raised as Muslims. They're converts. And in my sense, some of those people are the people that would be drawn to the alt-right here. They're people, young, disgruntled, whatever, who are looking for an outlet for violence. And I'm wondering how you sort of, whether you go to that bigger issue or how you deal with that.
That's a great segue. Very much.
That's a whole.
So, well, a couple of things there. I mean, one is just that, at this point, we kind of just want to reiterate, a lot of what we're talking about, we can kind of just shorthand it as the global war on terror kind of framework and narratives that are being applied that, affect the Muslim community at all these different levels, at levels of personal agency, of again, the oppressive state policies that are put upon them, but then we also, and we're running short on time because the conversation was so interesting, but we also go into thinking about, okay, so how as an ally, if I'm hearing these things in my daily conversations or in other contexts of my life, how can I try to do what you were suggesting? How can we shift that narrative? How can we try to move out of that? And it's really hard. And so we're going to go through a couple of little examples here and then ask you to do some practice. And because this is so big, we decided to focus this discussion just on the narratives around the Muslim ban. And we were inspired by a great op-ed that Dina wrote called, what's the title of it? How to Challenge the Muslim Ban Without Perpetuating Islamophobia, because many of us have been doing that because we're trying to do the right thing, but it's really hard to step out of the dominant narrative because it's so strong. So we're going to focus on that, and I'm going to give a couple of examples, and we'll just kind of run through them real quickly. So just imagine you're encountering somebody, I don't know where you are, you're like you're at the coffee shop, or maybe you have a relative who might have, you know, a reaction to the Muslim ban that said, yeah, hey, it's about time we did this, you know. We need to do something to protect us from terrorists. And so what do you say in that moment? And again, I want to reiterate, we don't have the perfect answer. There's no silver bullet, perfect list we're going to give you. These are some things that we've been trying to practice, but you guys are going to have other ideas, and we will want to hear your take on this. So if you said, hey, you know, I think the travel ban is just un-American. It goes against our founding values. Any reactions to how that, are there any problems with this answer? Any holes you would poke in it?
I got a big Facebook conversation all about this.
Yeah.
Goods and bads and.
Well, what would you say? What do you think about
Well,
this?
one of the things they say is, oh, it's good because ISIS controls the airports from which those countries are importing
right. Well,
people.
You can go down a rabbit hole with that one. Go ahead. Yes, Ken?
Just a point of clarification. Are you talking about travel ban 1.0 or 2.0? Are you talking about the explicitly, the language that was explicit in terms of exemptions, or are you talking about version 2.0, which has the same effect,
yes,
but the wording of the executive order is different?
No, well, that's great. We were kind of being like blanket travel ban, but in general, like what you're pointing out is I think an important problem with this reaction, which is that call it a Muslim ban. It is not a travel ban. That the language shifted around that. Like, let's just say what it is. Yeah, Sharon?
Well, I'm just going to say that specific wording, I would hesitate to use. And founding values is great, but un-American, I think in a debate with somebody is.
Thank you.
It doesn't address the biggest problem with the previous sentence, which is the most toxic part of the previous sentence was terrorist. You need to dismantle that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really true. Yes.
And I want to reiterate that in my discussions. It's always, what is a terrorist? We have travel ban on Irish Catholics. You really have to tear that apart.
Okay, thank you.
By the same token, I mean, just to follow up with that, I mean, the quote-unquote, I'm thinking of the Florida bombing, or the Florida nightclub. Yeah, Muslim, but he wasn't come from overseas, he was local. So how do you respond to that?
Okay.
So in conversation with Senator Ted Cruz on his version of this during the New Hampshire primary and one of his supporters, the point that worked the best was to say that bars based on religion are not our way of doing business. And this actually worked to an extent even with Senator Cruz and with his supporters. That, not so much a ban, but religious tests are not the way that we should be behaving in this country, to the point where the senator himself said that he would apply his exemptions not just to Christians and Yazidis, but to Muslims similarly situated. And his supporter, surprisingly enough, said, I am an evangelical Christian and a strong supporter of Senator Cruz. As an evangelical Christian, we do not turn our backs on people in need. This is refugees. And as an American, I do not think we should apply religious tests. So those are points that have some traction, even with those that are not normally thought of as allies.
No, that's great. And I think a couple of things came up in this discussion. So one is that we don't want to perpetuate the dominant narrative. And all these examples I'm going to give you, there are ways that happened. I mean, one thing here is like, we didn't challenge the word terrorism. We also, if we're kind of saying like, you know, America's founding values, in some ways we have to remember, like, people like to think of those as like so solid, but we did, you know, the country was founded on genocide, and we have to remember slavery and those kinds of things. So we don't want to just throw those people
I was going to say,
yeah.
whose values, what values, and as a person of color who was born and raised in this country, that founding value stuff doesn't ring with me, doesn't resonate with me.
So, but it's hard, and I think that you know, we all find ourselves saying those things at various times, and we're just trying to like complicate it a little bit. What's that? But one thing you could do is just call out and say, hey, you know, we want to expose that this ban is actually racist. I like Ken's idea of like just calling out the religious test aspect of it. So, so this is another way you could do it. You could kind of just say, hey, you know, I just think this thing is racist. It doesn't work for me. People are actually having their lives disrupted by it. So that could be a better answer. Somebody in our last workshop kind of found some holes in this one, like saying, you know, by calling it racist, you might really turn the other person off. So, I mean, I think that like again, there's no perfect way to do these things.
I think the strongest counter argument is the U.S. Constitution says all people are created equal. What do you say? That's my opinion.
Yeah.
And maybe this is the fact-based stuff that gets me in trouble on Facebook. But the things I keep telling people over and over again is that Muslims have been in this country since before the Revolutionary War, and that Thomas Jefferson specifically mentions them. There's a wonderful passage in his autobiography where he says the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and the infidel of every description are who I meant to protect with the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom and the First Amendment. And so you know, these are people that have family here, they have a history here. You know, it's not the us or them that starts at the border that starts at 9/11.
Yeah.
Sometimes works.
Well, that's good to hear. That's good. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking that the last workshop I was in of communications and all about like changing the narrative, a lot of what they were saying is like, facts don't work. Or like starting conversations with people with facts often doesn't work. I think we also need, and I kind of, that's my go-to.
I think it's many of us have that bias for sure. Well, let's look at this one. Okay, so what if you said this and said like, hey, you're just a racist jerk. You know, don't you know that all immigrants are good for the economy? We shouldn't be blocking them from participating. What problems do you see with this?
That's insightful. So
Yeah.
if you're looking for
Having a
containing
conversation.
some sort of emotional thing that you'll regret, and you're going down that path.
Yeah.
You're making an enemy instead of
Good.
having real conversation.
Even though you might feel this inside, it might not always be the best way to have the discussion.
If you frame it in terms of the economy, then, well, if we just need more immigrants for the economy, we could just get them from somewhere else, right? You know.
Yeah, or it's kind of like, hey, they're human beings. Whether or not they're valuable for the economy shouldn't really matter.
Yeah, for me, this whole thing about immigrants are good for the economy, and I work on immigration, you know, for my job, is you're saying that there's good immigrants, there's bad immigrants. It's almost patronizing. It's like saying, oh yes, these immigrants are very industrious, so they work 16 hours a day, and blah, blah, blah. So there's something very patronizing about that concept.
It's just commodifying.
Yeah.
I still like that concept in some areas, but if the argument that someone makes against you is terrorism and what you say back is the economy, then you're just kind of talking past each other.
Yeah.
If the argument is we can't have immigrants because it's going to ruin the economy, then you can bring up a different argument.
All right, that's a good point. That's a good point. So yeah, don't attack the person, the speaker personally. And you know, one thing that I like to think about when I think about that is that, of course, you know, you're not going to convince that person if you attack them, but you're also not going to convince the people who might be listening, who might also be in the room. Like, you're able to engage in dialogue if you have a better chance of doing that. Another thing that this is a little trick we've been kind of learning from Kellyanne Conway, because she never answers the question directly ever. And one of the things she does is that she will take a word that the person who asked the question says and then just pivot on that word. So, you know, aren't you afraid that Trump's not going to do this in his first 100 days? And she'll just be, you know what I'm afraid of? I'm afraid of blah, 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 whatever it is. So that's like, I like this one because I find it really, when I'm in the moment, it's really hard to say all the right things, but that gives me like a little like way to, one little thing I can kind of remember in the moment to try to do this.
So Mary is actually advocating for the Kellyanne Conway School of Communication.
I am. It seems to work.
Doesn't that
Huh?
lack integrity?
That's good.
But so you could say, like, yeah, we should protect people from terror, like those who are fleeing violence that are perpetuated by our own country. And, you know, again, affirming the humanity of the people who are affected by this situation. Okay, so here's like our last response that's giving us some facts from the Cato Institute.
Sorry, what was the query?
Pardon me?
What was the query?
Oh, it's the same one. It's about time somebody does. These are all just different examples. So this one is, you know, giving us some facts from the Cato Institute, and, you know, it said, instead of banning them, we need to work with these people to strengthen our national security. So, any problematics? I mean, we've kind of already said, like, we all like to lead with facts. I do it myself, but as Sahar said, sometimes leading with values will actually persuade the person more than that. What about the strengthen our national security piece?
Well, that gets back to the whole concept of shared security. We're all people, we're all in this together. It's kind of this whole non-violent approach to terrorism, whereby which everybody has a stake in this.
Yeah, one thing, I totally get the connection you're making. One thing to be wary of, though, is that there is sort of a good Muslim, bad Muslim construct. And going back to the CVE programs, if you're a good Muslim, then you'll help us by surveilling your community, because we need you to be there on the front lines to do that. So it's like they can take the language that sounds perfectly reasonable, but you have to kind of like look at how it's coded. Yeah.
Yeah, and that sort of sounds to me like, you know, you all need to work on identifying the alt-right people in your communities, and why is that my responsibility?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So don't myth bust if you can help it. I can't always help it, but think about that. One thing that I think is interesting is also, especially if it's somebody that you know, you can kind of draw upon your own experiences. You can say, like, I used to kind of have that same feeling, but I've learned, I've thought about it, I've learned about it, I've talked to some people, and now I'm actually thinking this way. That can help, again, in inviting dialogue. Or somebody was saying in the last workshop, I think is great, like, talk about your the people who've been affected by this situation. Like, I've had clients that have, their families have been separated because of this. Give some of those kinds of facts might affect people more. And then the last thing is, putting forward that alternative value or conviction. How would the world be different if we were able to put that forward? And actually, AFSC, I don't know if they talked about this in the last workshop, Sahar, but AFSC just did this study on messages about profiling and surveillance in the Muslim community because of this project. And one of the things that they found out, they tested a bunch of different frames, and the two that had the most success is when talking to a progressive audience, frame it around respecting human rights. Like, people thought that, like, that made sense to them. You're right, this is violation of human rights if we're just applying these profiling and surveillance things to this community. This is wrong. But more moderate audiences liked the safety and peace frame. That really worked for them. If all of us deserve to feel safe from hatred and to live in peace, like, that seemed to work for folks who might have been on the other side. So that's something to keep in mind in the moment as well. So I think we're kind of running out of time. I think maybe should we just go to the final piece? Sure. I think so. Yeah. Okay, so if we had more time, we would make you guys practice this. But I am going to just hand out, these are just the do's and don'ts if you want to pass them around. And, thank you. Sure, oh wait, here we go. Oh, you want to talk through the narrative? Sure? No, okay. So, Gabe.
Yes, one of the things we can do as a community and in your localities is to get involved in something that we're calling Sanctuary Everywhere. Now, we're not talking about a physical sanctuary church, but we're talking about the concept that our communities need to be a sanctuary for everybody. That is not just immigrants, but also Muslims, LGBTQ communities, everybody who's vulnerable and marginalized. So when you pass when there are efforts in your localities to pass ordinances to protect immigrants, we also encourage you to make note that there are other vulnerable communities that need also protection in terms of civil rights and due process. So that's one thing, and many of the different AFSC immigration programs throughout the country are working in this movement.
So number 2, learn from the affected community. So you'll see a list on the handout there of organizations that are challenging war on terror, rhetoric, and policies. So kind of just subscribing to them and learning from them and how they're building power and resisting. And just remembering that decisions on what solidarity and allyship should look like should come from the impacted community. So kind of being aware of that and being aware of centering the needs of the impacted community and learning from the impacted community. And reading and sharing news and resources from Muslim organizations.
And organizers, there's a great list of people to follow on Twitter, including Dina, that write really interesting stuff.
Yes, another thing you can do is to use your hard-earned money to donate to local Muslim organizations that actually protect the civil rights and due process of members of their community. And these include organizations that represent Muslims who are being targeted, who are going under surveillance, in particular FBI visits, and are being accused of crimes that have to do with national security. So I just want to add one thing. Shortly after the election of Donald Trump, the American Civil Liberties Union got $7 million in 1 week. But that's great to donate to the ACLU, and I'm on the board of the ACLU. But there's also smaller, understaffed, and underfunded local Muslim community organizations that are actually doing legal representation that do need your donations.
Right, and I just wanted to comment. I think I think the Council on American Islamic Relations was one of the ones that was sort of potentially being engulfed in this. That's an organization that funds terrorists.
Yes.
But
there are some of these anti-Muslim think tanks that have targeted CARE as being tied to terrorist organizations internationally. And also there's a movement afoot in the administration to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign
as a terrorist organization.
Terrorist organization designation, which would shut down the largest Muslim civil rights organization in the United States.
And I was going to argue that that's an additional argument for donating to them.
I would, and then that would implicate you, which is great.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
Yeah, no, that'd be wonderful. Okay.
So I'd also even recommend going one step beyond donations. There are opportunities for alliance, putting on public forums. Back about a month and a half, 2 months ago, we put on a forum with Shannon from the Muslim Justice League, with CARE, and with others at MIT, with the Japanese American group.
Great.
And the point was that the problems associated with being locked up during World War II and what's going on today have some resonance. But it was actually not to an audience of Quakers. It was to an audience, a cross-section of the community and MIT students. And again, these opportunities do present, and they should be acted on.
Great, thank you. This one?
Oh yes, of course.
Kind of what Ken just said.
And also, yeah, you can also learn more about the roots of anti-Muslimism from the Crusades to colonialism to imperialism, and there's a lot of scholarship written by the affected communities. I'm talking about Edward Said, talking about many scholars, and there's a list of recommended readings that we have. Also form a study group some of these books are very dense and rich in content. And also learn about the struggles of the African American Muslim community in the United States, which is the largest Muslim community in the United States. What were their struggles? Remember, they were targeted by the FBI during the Black Power movement in the United States. So we need to see how that relates also to what we're talking about today.
And lastly, and this is actually something that you all are already doing, really, by attending this workshop, but become a better ally. So kind of remembering that as an ally, we have to make sure we're not perpetuating microaggressions and perpetuating the same oppressive systems that we're resisting. And so just kind of remembering, I have kind of a list of things to go through. So first, ask yourself, who asked me? So remembering that decisions on what solidarity should look like should come from the impacted community, and making sure to consult with the impacted community on what their needs are. For strategies to be effective, they have to be sensitive to those most impacted and align with the work already being done by them. So again, taking cues from the impacted community and following the leadership of the impacted community is what should center your solidarity and your acts of allyship, as opposed to centering maybe our own needs or our own vision of what solidarity should look like. Second, don't replicate oppressive systems. So if your solidarity and allyship reflects and replicates the same rhetoric that the US uses to justify war, which is that Muslim women are weak or lack agency and are in need of physical saving, then essentially we're just kind of perpetuating that anti-Muslimism and replicating that same oppressive system. This also means being aware of what it means when we resist racist policies by calling them un-American and invoking, as we said, American founding values as reasons to oppose them, because this tends to erase a lot of people of color who, were harmed by those same founding values. Third, hold yourself accountable. So real allyship means constant self-awareness and learning and unlearning certain things that how we've been socialized, I guess, from what we see in the media and from what we hear from family members or etc. So kind of just constant self-reflection and self-assessments on just working on within yourself, I guess, first, and then again listening to the impacted community. And lastly, remember that being an ally is a full-time commitment. So it's important to understand the complexities and interconnectedness of oppressive systems. And being an ally is a commitment to resisting larger systems of oppression, of militarized policing, of racism, and of imperialism. So being an ally means a commitment to solidarity work across movements and a commitment to reading and learning from the impacted community. And again, I would divert attention to the resources that are on the handout and the readings and books.
Yeah, and the last thing we'd like to invite you to do, and you can either do it right now if you're handy with your mobile, but we'd love for you to either tweet out or post something on Facebook about one thing you learned here today, and even share a resource, which is a longer version of what I just handed you. It's actually 15 things you can do. And it's at that link there. But we'd love it, even if you just want to share one thing you learned, that would be so great. And if you need more time to think about it, you just take a snap of this image and maybe do it later. But this was a great discussion. I really appreciate everybody being here, and really would love to talk to anybody afterwards who's got a couple of minutes, but I know Sahara's got it set up, so no. They don't have any setup to do. So. Also, if you want copies of the timeline and of the PowerPoint, just leave your email address up here and we'll be happy to send them to you. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.